It'll get recorded.
I sent him a message, told him to come on down if he wants to.
He's gonna be fighting anyways.
We can go ahead. I'm good with that. I can always pitch him back to the fact. So, you on?
Yeah.
Okay. So, for you guys, welcome to the ACW Marshal class. So I'm going to teach you kind of how we run tournaments, as well as some things as a fighter that you want to know, so that you can follow rules and you know whatnot, not get in trouble, or show up to some big event like that and not be able to fight because you didn't have the right things, right? So we always want everybody to have a good time. My name, of course, is Steve Martin. Some of you guys will meet me for the first time. Some of you know me for a while. I started marshaling in 2018 when it was still the ACL, and it kind of ran up into IMCF. I've done probably 30 major tournaments since 2018. Most of those I'm the head marshal, like running the event, or I'm backing up the head marshal who is running the event. I participate in a couple different leagues marshaling, and for me it's really where my friends at. I kind of go to places where they invite me to go, things like that. So I'll be going to Mexico in a month for the IMCF World Championship. We'll be in Salt Lake City for Spring Nationals for ACW next weekend. So a lot of fun events out there that you guys can participate in. My favorite, of course, is ACW. That's where I kind of grew up, so to speak, right? ACW's been around since 2019, after the ACL sort of split, and I've been sort of a senior referee with them the entire time. Used to be two of us. Now there's only one senior, which is me, and then the head ref, which is Lance Hoffman. You guys saw Lance if you were in the last tournament at Lords Mobile. He is responsible for all the rules for the league, all the organization for the marshals, things like that. So any changes or suggestions we have, we feed up to Lance, and he kind of evaluates and decides what he wants to do. Our rule set is based off of IMCF. We were the IMCF rule set initially. We folded that into our own rule set, which is basically identical, and then that was 2020. So here we are several years later. The IMCF rule set is sort of evolved on its own, so is ours. So they're not exactly the same anymore. And if you want, I can point out some of the differences as I see them as they come along, or I can stick strictly to ACW's, no problem. So, typically, when you're a referee in the league and you're at an event, you'll have one of two shirts on, right? So this is the standard ACW shirt. You can get it at any of the sporting goods stores, like a basketball referee's jersey with the vertical stripes all the way on the arms. Sometimes you might also be asked to wear something more in the yellow side of the house. It says Marshall on it, and stuff like that. So those are options. And if you're at a Ren Fair, you might get asked to wear garb, depending. The senior referees wear a slightly different jersey, so it's got the black shoulders on it. The patch I put on myself, that's not required, which definitely can. It's a little more expensive. It also looks a little cooler, and it sets that level apart from the others because they have certain responsibilities that the rest of the marshals are not able to have at the event. Now, I typically would trade off with other senior guys, so at the event, if I'm not the senior or the night marshal or the head referee, then I don't have those powers either, even though I might have had it at the previous tournament if I was in that role. Some organizational stuff for ACW, right? So ACW is divided into regions, right? And so the region we're in is Toll. It's Texas, Oklahoma, Arkansas, Louisiana, not to be confused with Alabama instead of Arkansas. Sometimes you'll hear that said. And so it's the four state area, right? So we all come together and we do local events. And so, like the Tulsa Tyrants will have events around town. Scott Fest in the fall is a big one that they do, things like that. Those are pretty local level things. And usually you've got a lot of new fighters coming to the local events, first time in armor. They're probably borrowing armor. So as a referee for those events, you're focused more on education and training. So you want to keep everyone, of course, safe, but it's a great opportunity to show somebody when they're breaking, the rules, or maybe they don't understand what they're doing wrong, and you can kind of explain that. So it's a lot of teaching moments. And so as a person reffing those events, yes, you want it to be safe, but no, you're not out there to throw cards at anybody, right? Typically it's for entertainment purposes and fundraising for teams or getting fighters a chance to fight a kid, right? So from there you progress to a regional level, right? So our Toll region would have a tournament, and all the chapters in our area, in our region, would come together at that one tournament, and they would fight each other. You could do smaller events where they call the chapter match, basically, where two different chapters in the league will fight each other, and they have a format there that they go through to declare a winner. That's one way to do it. Regional events are more like, we're going to hold a full tournament similar to what we'd have in Salt Lake City next weekend, where it's, you've got the full brackets and things, but you're choosing a champion for your region. because from there you're going to go to a national level in the ACW, and it's expected that pretty much all the duelists in the duels at the national level, they qualified and placed at the regional before they were added to the list. So occasionally it's an open tournament, and we'll accept entries that are not, that way. But if it's a big tournament and we're planning, to do more beyond that, a lot of times they'll limit the field. Like Salt Lake City, I think we're only fighting 4 hours a day. We have more than just the regional champions going to fight, and so it'll be a challenge to kind of fit it all in. But sometimes we're fighting 8-9 hours a day. It just depends, how many people we've got and what we're trying to do. So you'll have a regional commander. I think is Brandon. I think the total regional commander right now. He may be, or Anton Zimlock. Excuse me. I don't know why I said that wrong. Anton Zimlock, who's down in Texas and San Angelo with the Ironclad, is the regional commander for toll. These days. Before that, for a number of years, it was Randy Wrinkle, great guy and stuff. He doesn't fight as much anymore, especially steel. It's just everybody ends up with injuries or just whatever, and it's hard to do that. Like I don't fight because I have injuries that would, hurt me pretty bad if I got those hit. That sort of thing. So that's kind of the structure of the league, where you have, somebody running the league at the top. You've got his support staff, and then we have a series of chapters. They all roll up into regions. The regions roll up into a national level. If we had enough, we might do, sometimes they've done conferences where they split the regions kind of down the middle, and then they might have a conference championship for each one, and then that goes national. It just sort of depends on participation. Using my little PowerPoint here to keep up with stuff. You'll see, so there's like these Pacific Northwest, the Pacific region, the Southwest region, of course we're told, you have the Southeast, the Atlantic region, the Midwest, and the Great Plains. So I have a complete map. Now, as far as regional commanders and things go, that's all changed since the last time I did the slide deck, so this doesn't really help me to show you guys, but kind of gives you an idea of the regions. I don't know if you can see some of that on there, but each one's kind of color-coded. And we don't, not always do we have every region with chapters in it that are participating, so it just kind of varies. So stuff sort of ebbs and flows, right? So give you a little more information. What's it like to be a referee, right? So what refs do? What encompasses that, right? So we covered sort of that conference, national level stuff, right? So a senior referee is what you consider like a national ref. So if you're considered a senior, then you're skilled enough and experienced enough to run a national event. And if you're a regional referee, each region typically has a designated referee that's not one of the senior guys, and they're responsible for their region and making sure that regional tournament goes off, and then they travel to the national tournaments, and they form a lot of that support staff at the national level to kind of make sure that we have enough referees to kind of run that size of an event. That plenty of times we'll go to events and we won't have enough referees. We'll always, of course, have our head ref and our kind of center referees, but we don't have enough counters, right? And that's usually filled by referee positions. So quite often you'll see regional commanders counting, or someone from the region who's in their place sort of proxying and counting for us. So it's always good if you're a chapter president or a regional commander or any of those leadership areas to understand how to referee and have some experience doing it, because quite often you'll get called on to assist in those situations if we run up short or somebody has to leave or gets sick or hurt or whatever. When you're competing, like I mentioned earlier, at that regional or your chapter level, it's okay to make mistakes. You're still learning. You don't want, of course, anybody to get injured. You don't want anybody to lose their tempers and stuff. And as a referee, if you can't get a fighter to calm down and reasonably have a conversation, usually they get asked to not fight the rest of the day, right? If I can't tell you to stop and have you stop, then I can't have you in the list, right? So you have to be in control of yourself. That's usually at a chapter level. We would still have someone be red carded as if they've just lost their minds, and it's things like that. Let's see, at the I'm just making sure I didn't miss anything here. When you go to the conference levels and the national levels or any of the international competitions, every fighter that's coming to those should understand the rules front to back. There are no excuses. I didn't know that was a rule, or my equipment wasn't ready for inspection. You should have gone through several chapter events to a regional event where the referees at the region would have pointed out the problems that you might not be able to fight at if you showed up at national. So when a fighter shows at a national event, he's expected to have all of his gear taken care of. If his gear is not within spec, as whatever weapons, equipment, and stuff, then he's got to fix it or he's not going to fight. It's not I'll let you slide today because I know you're borrowing somebody else's equipment. It doesn't fit right. It's got to be right. And so that's kind of that big difference, but as you kind of go up, it just becomes more expected that you know what you're doing. You've been around a little bit longer, right? As a referee, there are certain benefits that are supposed to get paid out. So when you're reffing an event, if you're the head ref of a chapter level event, the chapter should be paying you $50 for that event. So every time you do an event, you should be getting $50 for your time, right? You're not a fighter, you're there on your own time. I think all of us referees would prefer to fight if we could. And so it's sort of it's more of a sacrifice than say a fighter gun. Right at the regional level, that's $100 for the head referee. That's not the entire referee staff, mind you. That's the person running it. There's a lot of responsibility there, which we'll kind of get into. It's $250 for a conference level, and actually $450 for the national. Some of that stuff varies. This is a couple years old, so I might have my numbers off a little bit from what the league's doing now. But the idea there is that the higher the level of the event, the more responsibility you have, the sort of it graduates up. Typically, a regional referee or higher doesn't have to pay for their membership, so they get a free membership every year. They do enough events; it's just kind of a way of giving back. They don't have to pay to get into the events. I would say I have the best seat in the house for watching the fights. Right? Nobody gets a better seat than I do. I have a pretty deep knowledge of the rules because of it. I also have a knowledge of tactics from being around and watching the teams, perform their tactics or talk about them. So quite often you can be a great resource for your chapter to help train them on this is the way I see them executing, or things like that to give your team a chance to do better. And yeah, it's just a lot of fun, right? You get to understand the armor kits that the guys are wearing. So if you're brand new and you don't have armor yet, and you're trying to decide what you want to order, reffing the events will give you a pretty good indication of what works and what doesn't work, right? For these guys, without you having to try it and spend money on it yourself and find out it's not for you. So that's another good one to look at. So that's kind of the referee sort of culture, right? We all will be on Facebook talking to each other in different martial groups, trying to plan out the logistics of the event and things like that, or just generally hand out training. Sometimes we'll send out some videos of fights, maybe in slower motion, and let folks count and see who gets what counts out of it, just as a sort of training experience. So we're trying to develop some different ways to help with that. It's pretty organic. I would say more based off of the individual person and what they do per class, right? Some classes, depending on the marshal or referee, would be different, in terms of what you get taught. Safety is the number one sort of concern of any marshal, right? If folks get hurt, that's the one thing we want to avoid. So that comes into inspection. So you're inspecting weapons, helmets. You're inspecting the fighters as they come into the list, things like that, right? We're managing the fights themselves from the center, right? So we're starting and stopping the fights for the duels. You've got that one center guy. In the melees, you still have one center person, but you'll have a field marshal that's assisting, right? Or one or two of those, depending on the size of the list and whether there's enough space to safely move around, right? Any small size list as a marshal, if you get more than say 4 or 5, maybe 6 people in there, you should really consider starting it and leaving it and waiting until some people are on the ground or they're at least clustered in corners before you kind of slip under the rail and come back in. So always be cognizant of the fact you don't have to stand in the list while they're fighting. It's a small space.
They can't see you.
No. I mean, you can pretty much expect.
Blindsided, man.
Yeah. You can definitely get hit. I mean, as a marshal, you are considered part of the ring, right, of the list. So it's kind of like soccer. If the ball bounces off the referee, oh well, it's like bouncing off the goalpost. It's a similar thing of a fighter. So if a fighter runs into a marshal and he falls down, the fighter's down. It's like he ran into a downed fighter and tripped or something, right? That's his problem, right? There's no, and an accidental hit on a marshal is not an unsportsmanlike act, right? So it's not a carding offense either, right? Now, if it looked like you hauled off and hit him or ran him over and out of your way, that's different. But it's a situational thing, right? And there's a lot of situational rules that you'll find, just in armored combat because you kind of have to sometimes, and those are always problem things that kind of leave stuff open to the person's individual interpretation of what they saw happen, right? So quite often there's not video. As a night marshal or a head referee, I'm listening to my referees because they've got, we've established our trust and our integrity together. If he tells me this is what he saw, then that's what he saw, right? And generally, when there is an incident, I will try to kind of get together the folks that did see it, that other marshals, the team captain for each side, and we sort of discuss what we saw, what we understand. It is the night marshal or the head marshal's decision about what the outcome of that is, but he can't take that under his advisement. So he doesn't have to follow sort of, the recommendation or the desires of the others. He relies on his knowledge of the rules, you know, past times when that's happened, things like that. Definitely had it happen, you know, before where, you know, miscommunications happen and then teams, you know, kind of lose matches or rounds because they didn't understand, you know, what was going on, things like that. So you always want to strive to be as open and transparent with everybody, you know, captain-wise as you can. You're obviously not communicating it to every individual person on a melee team, but to let the captain know so clearly so he understands and he can communicate with his team, you know, what's going on, right? And there's still things like, is the fighter down, or was he hooking, or was he doing something illegal? Was his armor, failing, and that's why, you know, we did hit somebody when they were already down. So it's all those kinds of interpretations, right, that we go through. You've got another marshal or referee who's gonna time the events. You've got a secretary who's responsible for running the brackets that decide who the winning team or fighter is, right? So they're dealing with who fights who win. It's a really stressful and time-consuming job. As a head marshal or a night marshal, quite often before the tournament happens, I'll spend hours and hours laying out the brackets to figure out like how much time is it going to take to complete this event or that event, given this or that format, things like that. And I won't go super in depth into the secretary stuff because I could teach an entire 2-hour class just on that. But there's a lot to that, right? Am I going to do a round robin, a single elimination, a double elimination, a triple elimination? Do I do a round robin to that? Do I run a single the first day and then maybe another single the second day, seeded by the first day's single elimination, you know, bracket? So there's a lot of those choices, right, that you kind of work with. And quite often you work with the event coordinator or organizer. How much time do I have? You know, how many breaks do I need? You know, what's the weather going to be like? Is the list sufficient? All those kind of things is part of kind of what you do. So typical timeline. Any questions about that kind of marshal duties, so to speak? And I'll get into more details as we kind of go along, of course, and stuff. I'll give you a better idea. So typical timeline of events. There's a pre-fight inspection that happens, so all the weapons get checked. And we're going to go into that in a minute, right, and go through these. Then you've got a pre-fight safety briefing. A lot of people will call that the captain's meeting. So I'll do it I can do it sometimes with all the duelists if I'm concerned. I definitely always do it with the captains and the regional commanders there so they can disseminate information to their duelists and stuff too. It's not necessarily a private meeting, it's just limiting the questions so we can get it done in a reasonable amount of time. But I'll cover several topics in there, and I've got another slide that kind of goes into what I'll say for that, that goes specifically. Then of course we run the duels, and we run the melees. Sometimes there's special fights, other times there's night fights, and other places they call those pro fights, where you can do, you know, more knees and other MMA type moves. We don't typically do ground and pound, but some places that's allowed. So there's just different, depending on the rule set, we'll see different things. So before the captain's briefing, we do inspections. And so right here, I'll cover some of what goes on in inspections, right? So I have several things I have to have for inspections. One piece of equipment is calipers. So that is the scientific measurement tool that we have for gaps and lengths and all those things. So like I'm measuring eye bars, just different things. This is a great one for that. It's not long enough to do full lengths of weapons, so you're going to have a tape measure. Pull some of this stuff out. Typically, I keep things in a little bag, and then when I go over to do inspections, I just pull out the bag, dump it on the table, and then I've got all my stuff, right? So, tape measures, measure the length on the weapons. Cloth ones work. I'll take one of these cloth ones. They sell them on Amazon. They're a sticker, and I'll take one of my spare Marshall sticks, and I'll stick it to the stick. And then I can just lay the stick on the table. Other folks will tape the thing to the table, and you're just using it over and over again. So to have to extend this thing out every time and find it every time is kind of a pain. So find things that work for you and do those. I know my stick's length, and for like polearm dueling, quite often one breaks and somebody grabs another and they bring it over and it's too short. I can use my own flag stick to sort of kind of gauge where that's at, you know, whether it's allowed or not by the rules. Other stuff, you've got a luggage scale. So these will transition between pounds and grams and ounces and all that stuff, and you can wrap it around the weapon. I'll show you that in a minute. You've also got what we call the Marshall gauge. This is my gauge that I made. It's not necessarily what everyone else will use, but this covers all the angles and dimensions and things that you have to have on the weapons. And that's, so this is pretty critical to inspecting things.
What's the large one?
The large arc is going to be 2-handers. The smaller arc is going to be 1-handers on the weapons. And I've got a cheat sheet that I quite often, I bring a bunch of these to my events and I set them on the table to make it real simple. This is just an extraction from the rules. So if this is ever different than the rule book of course takes precedence, but it's a nice aid just to kind of remind you. After you've done a couple, it's not too bad, but it's got a lot of numbers, you know, in there. And I just have a strict rule that I don't remember anything I can write down, so numbers on the sheet, right? So I would encourage you not to try to memorize these, but just have a way of getting, you know, access to it, right? On the back side of this, I have like a full checklist that I run through for each type of weapon or piece of equipment that has to be inspected. Like in our case in ACW, we inspect helmets. Some other places may not inspect them when they do the weapons. They may just check them into the list, right? So I'll walk through some of that with you. Well, first, a couple other things. You've got stickers that you put on the weapons after they've been successfully inspected. Quite often, I will print my own stickers, and so I'll give you a few examples of those. You can see different places I've been with different stickers. That's Scott Fest from a couple years ago. And I bet if you look at some of these weapons, you'll find stickers from almost 4 and 5 years ago. Yeah. Yeah. So a lot of guys will leave them on there. It's sort of like having luggage stickers on your luggage from all the places you've been, right? And so I see stuff from Canada in 2019 still, you know, with stickers on them sometimes. So I will typically print them and I just buy some labels and take them up to Office Depot and they'll print them for me. Usually I will leave, for big events, I leave a space on the sticker for the referee to initial each time. So then if I see a weapon we see a weapon that's a problem, we can maybe look at the initials and talk to the marshal or referee about why he passed it. If you can, I'm not expecting them all to remember, but that's kind of the purpose there, is just to make sure they're not counterfeit, you know, that kind of thing. I've never had anybody fake one that I've caught, but it's never hurts to be careful, right? I'll carry colored Sharpies. If a weapon doesn't pass, let's say the tip is too sharp, I can lay my gauge on there and I can kind of trace that outline. And so that clearly shows the fighter, like if I'm gonna grind that tip to the right dimensions, where am I grinding it to, right? So when I come back, the marshal's not over and over just saying no, right? It's got some, yeah, some understanding. So we try to do that whenever possible. That is most of what I have on the table. This doesn't often get used, but just for your own knowledge, the depth gauges for steel and other materials. So we have rules on how thick certain metal has to be. I've never really had much of a use for it, but as a head marshal, I tend to have one in my stuff most times, just in case it comes up. Never really had a lot of big use for that. Second rule I have always is 2 is 1, 1 is none. If you only have one luggage scale, chances are battery's gonna go dead, you're gonna lose it, whatever. So always try to have 2 if you can. I mean, this doesn't break the bank. Most of the stuff is fairly cheap. Even the calipers are maybe $10. So not too bad. And did I miss anything? I typically will have some kind of a rule book, you know, with me, of course, always, so I can pull that out. So you always want to keep that real physical copy, you know, on the table. Here's mine. And then of course the cheat sheets are fine. I keep these sheets up on my Dropbox account, so you guys should be able to download those for free. Just remind me, and I give somebody the link or put it out, and you guys can print them and take them to your own events when you're having them. So typical weapon checklist, right? So we're going to inspect weapons, and I've got a number of weapons here today, which is great. Some that I know will pass, and others, you know, that will fail. So we can go through several of these and see some examples of how we kind of do this. The way this typically works is you start out and you kind of go down through a list of things, right? So verify the weapon is based on its historical original from the same time period and stuff as the weapons are. The authenticity side of things. I am not a history teacher. I don't know all the authenticity rules and stuff, but we don't do fantasy armor, you know, and crazy fantasy weapons and that sort of thing. So if you can verify authenticity, absolutely, you know, do that. What I tell all the fighters is keep pictures of your weapons in their authenticity, you know, paperwork, right? So if I have a historical tapestry picture of this weapon in use or depicted by someone using it, then can sometimes be my historical accuracy, right? So I can see it, right? So shield shapes are commonly ones that catch people. Some of your axe head shapes and some other, you know, pieces also get in, you know, will get caught where somebody shows up with something that's, well, that's not quite right, you know. It's kind of funny though, and you think about it, most people that fought in war were farmers or tradesmiths, and they used the weapons that they used to do their jobs, right? Yeah, I mean, so you'll see a lot of those kind of things rolling around that really were farm implements turned into weapons, right? So it's kind of just all's out there, right? For your armor, your authenticity, you choose your date that your armor is based on, right? And you get 50 years. You can go 25 years in the future and 25 years back in time, and everything that you're using, weapons, shields, and armor, should be basically documented as used in that time period. In addition to that, it's got to be from the same region of the world. So don't use a Japanese katana if they weren't in Western Europe at that time period, right? Things like that. So that's the authenticity that encompasses all of this. We don't make a huge deal out of it around here, especially, I mean, chapter and other levels, you know, the lower levels. You go to international events, that can become a real sticking point for them.
So, say your weapon breaks in the middle of the fight, you get a new weapon, what it's not?
Yeah, so that's an interpretive thing, right? Does the marshal have an issue with that? To be quite honest, there's not that many different things that you run into.
Could just be handing you something.
Yeah, as a marshal, yeah, but do I want to send somebody home because they couldn't get a spare weapon that was period accurate?
I mean, if you
Not
got
really.
that far, then it probably made it through inspection.
Well, in this case, they broke it and
Everyone
got
has
somebody
different
else's,
types
right?
of
So if someone with a
previous leader.
Mongolian kid handed you their scimitar, their curves, you know, weapon to use, it's not the same as an arming sword if you're wearing.
It just wouldn't match hers if you had something that
Right,
was like
right.
out of
You
that
should,
period. It's
if
not
someone
something
comes up to the list with weapons and that doesn't match their armor in the time period, they shouldn't come in the list. And her question, you allowed them in because they had it, but then they broke one of the, you know, pieces, and the spare was not. Yeah. So typically, I mean, that's not a reason for me to want to disqualify somebody, right? So it sort of depends on the level that we're at and how much it's scrutinized, you know, for that event. But anything really domestically, we don't really get into that.
Do you ever get any weird armor?
I do sometimes, yeah. I mean, it's obviously armor that people make themselves, and you can tell. Other times they've gone someplace that's less than like reputable to get their armor. They didn't know that was not quality armor. It's not properly heat treated, things like that. So you can run into some really weird things. There is a kind of I don't know what the clause you would call it is, but basically any marshal can ban any weapon or piece of armor that they deem as unsafe, right? So if it isn't in the rules, it's basically banned, you know. And so you kind of have that get out of jail free card as a marshal to say, I mean, yes, this is in the rules, but I think you're going to break somebody if you use it, so I'm not going to allow it today, you know, things like that. So it's typically how things get handled. A lot of times I'll have stuff where the axe heads have to be pinned all the way through, but then they wrap them afterwards, and I can't tell if it's pinned. What do you do? Do you make them cut it off? Not really, right? I mean, that's not what I want to do. If you can't feel it, right? So then there's that sort of compromise of like, look, okay, I'm going to let you use this, and I want you to bring it to me and check it after you've used it. So if it feels like the head's loose, we're going to stop right there. And I might even say, if this head ever comes loose while today, you're going to get a red card for it. So I need you to be certain when you tell me. I'm going to trust your integrity until you prove me wrong. But this is going to be a more severe consequence because I couldn't verify, right? Some guys would absolutely not allow it. I mean, that's their prerogative to do that too. And some people might criticize me for saying that I would allow something as long as I don't see an issue with it happen, you know, because at that point, I always tell guys, look, man, I'm reffing this, you're fighting this. If I let you use that weapon and you break somebody in a really bad way, I have to live with that. And my marshals or referees have to live with it too, so I'm not doing that. You know, that's that point where you kind of say, no, we're not gonna do this because it's too risky.
It's just a hawk,
So-
it's not life or death.
Right. Yeah.
I've seen
So,
some armor that is articulated completely with rivets.
Yeah.
And I've seen other armor that's articulated with heavy leather. Is there a distinction in the rules in how you build your case, whether it's fully riveted and articulated or if it's held together?
no, I mean, except to say that in certain parts of the world, floating arms, which is where it's not articulated, where it's just tied on with your tie downs, your arming points. That's the way they did armor back then.
Yeah, with arming jacket.
Right,
In this
so-
case, we see like a big, like the upper arm piece, the elbow and here, and
Yeah.
the connection will be inside the whole structure.
Yeah.
And there's no rivets, but it seems like it's just as good, but I don't know if they have a problem.
It's accepted. Yeah, I mean, and that goes to it goes into the historical accuracy of it, right?
Right.
And so that's where you have to understand, is what you're using the leather strapping for instead of metal rivets something that was done in that period,
Right.
and with that armor? And if the answer is yes, then you're fine, right? And so you could get questioned to say, well, show me when they did this, back then. And a lot of times it's common sense, right? Using leather versus rivets, there's probably used a lot of leather back then, right? Rivets were not as easy to put in place, depending on,
Because it's like,
what
it's
you annexed
heavy,
to, right?
thick stuff.
Yeah,
And like
and
it's big patches that are riveted into, let's say, the elbow top.
Yeah.
And then we're bringing in, the two pieces inside there
Yeah.
and bolting them down
And
and stuff.
they did have paracord in the 1600s.
But they had rope.
But I'm just wondering
yeah.
if, when you go for an inspection, if somebody's like, what the hell is this,
So we don't inspect kits like that. We inspect helmets and weapons and shields. And sometimes shields are not mandatory to be inspected. When you come up to the list to enter the list, that's when you sort of get that visual inspection for authenticity. May or may not come up, but I don't have a problem with leather straps versus the articulated. Thank you. To be honest, I don't think that would be an issue for anybody. It's
they're
more.
a little more
Yeah.
freedom of movement, I like it.
Yeah, it's not bad, right? As long as you're safe, right? And that's the key piece. And I'll get into some of that here in a minute. So this list doesn't talk about the private and the primary and the secondary layers of your kit, but I will get into it after we kind of go through this. So next pieces that you've got to verify. If you guys are right, I'll go back to this list of kind of checking stuff. And let me take one of these axes just so we got it. So here's just a long axe, probably would be my guess on it. And so we'll say it's historically accurate, just to be safe. The next piece, every weapon that has a striking edge has to have a minimum 2 millimeter thickness of the striking edges. Okay,
Not the whole piece of metal, but the part
that hits
actually
you, right? Yeah, the part that hits the opponent has to be 2 millimeters minimum, and it cannot be wider than 8 millimeters in total. The reason for 8 is you get much wider than that, and you've essentially created a warhammer, right? And we don't use warhammers in the sport. So on the Marshall gauge, if you're looking at it, and these different gauges have different shapes and different curves. Mine probably has a few more than most. There is a piece on there that'll say 2, right? And there's an 8 over to the side, right? And so what you should be able to do is just set the 2 and just run it down the edge of the blade like that. And if it doesn't sink into the slot on the gauge, then it's at least 2, right? That makes sense for that? So that's kind of how you check that edge on the striking surface. Then the next one is strikeable surfaces are clean of graters, burrs, nicks, and uneven surfaces and chips. Every weapon that's been used has been chipped some. You can see this guy's got a few little marks, although it's pretty nice looking. You take a file to the edge, basically, and you file off the nicks and stuff. So if I took like a piece of cloth and I ran it along the edge, and that cloth was snagging and it was pulling like fibers, on it, then I would ask the person to file it, right? So it should be smooth. You can do it with your hand. I wouldn't recommend it because it's metal, man. It'll slice you up quick, right? So don't do it with your hand, but I could easily take a shirt and kind of run it around it, or a piece of cloth. I typically do something like that. I usually have like a towel, or like a terry cloth towel or something with me anyway, and stuff. So you want to check those edges for that, right? And keep in mind that when you file these edges, if I do it like at an angle, that's great, but now my blade edge may no longer be 2 millimeters right, right? So keep that in mind whenever you're filing on these things. Don't make it sharper when you do it, right? And this one is so new, I would almost do just a little bit around the edges so it's not a squared off edge, because it feels cutting just on my hands, rubbing on it, but it's legal, this way. Next thing I'll be checking, and this is every weapon type. So I'm holding an axe now, but every other weapon up here I pick up goes through the same first 8 steps, basically, right? So step 4, verify the item is in good repair and free of rust, right? So my haft is not cracked or broken. This head is not super loose and looking like it's going to fall apart. This has rust on it, but the rust is treated, it's not flaky. The main thing about rust is if I smack you in the face with it and a piece of rust comes off and goes into your eyes, we got a problem, right?
Okay, that happens.
And so no weapon should be used where that would happen. You should go back WD-40 it, scrub it down, grind it off, whatever you need to do, so that you don't get anybody, in the eye with a fragment. So then we check the weights and measures on these things. So you got to make sure that this weapon the length has to be inside the maximum and the minimum. So we're going to guess that this axe is a long axe to start. It's just my sort of educated guess at it. And you basically measure from the longest point on the weapon, which is not the haft in this case, it's the tip of the head, right? Down to the bottom of the pommel, and it would include the pommel. This one, of course, doesn't have one. It is, let me flip it to the centimeter side, because most everything in the rules is in centimeters, but it's basically 95 centimeters long, right? And so on the chart, when you look at a single-handed axe, it can be anywhere from 400 to 90 centimeter, or 40 to 90 centimeters, so it's not a single-handed. A two-handed axe is 9, 10, and beyond. So it's considered a two-handed axe in the ACW rule set, right? And then if you kind of scroll across on here, you'll see that a two-handed axe cannot weigh more than 3,000 grams, right? And so no way this thing is more than 3, but I'll show you guys. So measured the length, right? That step is good. The next one is verify the weight. It has to be either equal or greater than the minimum, and less than the max, right? So turn on my scale. No, I don't want ounces. Most of these scales, when they turn on, if they're not in the right setting, you basically just punch the button a few times and wait for it to stop blinking, and it'll be on that setting. So I got it on kilograms in this case. And the nice thing with these is it's got that cloth strap. So you set it down, make sure it's zeroed, and then you just kind of pick it up and hold it. So this one is 1,010 kilograms, or 1.01 kilograms. So it's 1,010 grams. We could be up to 3,000, right? So this clearly passes on the weight. This is not like a big melee two-handed either, right? I mean, it's like so some of those will get heavier. Some of these others I'll pick up in a minute. You can see will go way heavier, right? And honestly, sometimes it's hard to weigh something that long that's weighted on the end like that to get this on it, right? You'll find little tips and tricks. You wrap it around enough times or whatever, you can kind of get it to work. So then you check the weights. Again, if any of these weapons come in and you think it poses a distinct threat to the safety of the opponents, it's just basically disbanded at the event. If you're concerned about it, nobody's going to force you to let them use it. I guess is basically what they're saying. And it doesn't matter if it passes. This could pass everything, and we could still say no. I obviously need a good reason to do that. I wouldn't do it, for any other.
The reason I didn't like it in Illinois is because I didn't have that indicator for the
This?
handle. It was too round. They were like, that's really round.
That is not a disqualification on inspection. It is a smart move if you're going to fight with it, right? Because without an indexed weapon, you're not going to see the head. I've had plenty of people lose duels when they hit the fighter more times, but they hit the flat because they didn't know, which way the blade was turned. So definitely want that.
So you're hitting for points or whatever there, and like
it depends.
Your straight shot counts, but if it's like no edge discipline, you won't count it.
That's right, and we'll get into that in a few. Yeah, once I get into the duels themselves, we'll go through all that for you guys. So once I'm done with those, that's that first kind of 8 that every weapon gets. Then you kind of jump down to I'm on the axe side, right? So on axes, there's a one-handed axe. It has to have a 35 millimeter minimum radius. That's the radius of the striking edge, right? And then this is not a one-hander, this is a two-hander. It has to have a 50 millimeter radius, which is the big side on this one. So clearly, it's wider, right, than the big side. If that had been the striking edge, it wouldn't have passed, but clearly passes, right, from that angle.
So you're saying if it's smaller than that, it wouldn't pass?
Yeah, if it was sharper.
What
If it
is
was
smaller?
sharper than, right? This is maybe closer to what you might see sometimes, but you can see that doesn't fit either, right? It's smaller than the 50.
So long as
If
the
that was the
striking
striking
edge
edge.
exceeds that curve.
Yes, it can't be any more pointy than that, right? It's to keep you from getting into a pickaxe, situation or whatever, right? Yeah. Well, it's just, you're trying to spread the force out enough so that when you strike your opponent, it doesn't deliver too much. you know, in that one spot, right? The best way to defeat armor was with a hammer. If you can turn your axe into a point, you know, impact spot, it kind of becomes a hammer, right? Because we're not expecting to cut anybody, but it also does mean that they could potentially start to cut, depending on where they hit you. If it's not on the plate, you know, I've seen plenty of folks get hit on the top of leather and padding and still split their shins, you know, with the axe and stuff, just because it hit them full force, you know, right below the knee and stuff. So that's something to watch for. Next piece of this, so that's the main striking edge, right? That has those two dimensions: 35 for the one hand, 50 for the two hand. Okay. With that in mind, if you're using a one-handed axe, even if you don't have another weapon in your hand, you're not allowed to use it with two hands, right? So a one-handed axe with a 35, you know, millimeter angle with two hands is going to hit harder than we want you to. That's why it's a one hand, only for one-handers. That makes sense. Next piece, both one and two-handed non-striking edges have to be a 15 millimeter radius. So when we're talking about that, we're talking about this edge and these two angles, right? They're not striking curves on the weapon, but there are curves, non-striking, you know, curves that you get, and that has to be, what I say, 15, right? So 15, there's a 15 on here. 15 is actually pretty darn small. It's this one here in the middle, right? And so I should be able to match that up on one side, and then I should also be able to match that up over here. You can see this one is a little close, right? Overall, not too bad. I think what I would, if I was inspecting this one, I might ask you to round the very edge of the tip just a touch. And so what would happen if I do that? And I'm gonna set this down so you guys might not see as well, but I'll pick it back up in a second. So if I mark it, what I would do then is make sure you guys can see. Come a little closer if you want. I'll hold it up, but I would set this on, and I would sort of, okay, so you can see how there's too much space on either side, right? So just kind of lift it down to it's about right in there, and I just take my Sharpie, right, and trace it. And so if you grind it down to just where the Sharpie starts, not over the top, then
You're happy.
it should line up, right?
Yeah.
And this marker is a little low on juice, and so I probably mark a little bit outside of it. But the nice thing about using these is they're not permanent on metal, right?
Yeah. And
Alcohol's gonna take it right off. But basically, it gives them a firm idea. Okay, go out, let me grind this down, and just taking that little bit off is really all that's necessary. And so after a few times, you're kind of set. But yeah, you want to have one of these gauges. I sell these gauges. I make them every now and then for about $30 a piece. So I can bring you guys some. I'll bring some to the event and stuff. But that's kind of how it looks like. And here, I don't know if you want to hold it up for the camera, closer to the camera, or whatever. But let you see those. So that's usually what we try to do. Is just help you
Basically,
out with that.
using that gauge to mark the size of it.
So, thank you. The next part of the axis is every axe head has to have a minimum length, right, to it. And that is 70 millimeters. And it doesn't matter whether it's a one, I think, or a two-hander, but it's got to have minimum 70. On this gauge, there's actually a 70, but it's just notched. So right there to over there, basically. So as long as the head is longer than that, and clearly it's probably twice that, I would guess, right? No issue at all. But you can find some pretty small heads on axes these days.
Right, those tomahawks.
Yeah, well, I mean, they min-max, right? So they're not going to bring out something that's a fluffy pillow to hit you with, or they want to win. And so I don't fault anybody for trying to min-max. It's just difficult on us because you're always finding that little way to skirt around something, right? And stuff. So next piece on this is the haft securely, or the head securely attached to the haft, right, or the pole, and so it has to have a rivet that runs all the way through, not on one side, both sides, right? You can see it comes out either side, right? And that should be intact, you know, and not really going to fall apart. Quite often, you'll see somebody will just drive a nail in one side, and they don't go out the other. You can drive a nail all the way through, and then flatten the other side, just like you would a rivet, and have a pin holding it, right? Yeah, if you've got a decent nail and stuff. Don't use a picture frame. Sheet rock, one of those pieces, right? So for one-handed axes, you can have a metal haft, but if you do a metal haft, it needs to be like all welded together, right? And you can have wood hafts, and they do allow rattan hafts, They're starting to make some rules on the IMCF side around the rattan, but it doesn't affect us today. So yeah, like both of those are rattan.
What are they saying about it?
They're talking about minimum thickness on the striking side and needing to cover it so it's not exposed. I guess they didn't feel like rattan was period, I guess, so it needs to be covered up. I typically will wrap rattan anyway, because if it breaks and I have that wrapping around it, it tends to splinter less into the other people around me. But that's not required. But yeah, definitely can splinter and then be a real problem for folks. But any broken haft or a broken weapon is a problem. So, let's see, what else do we have here? Any protrusion on the back of the head has to be less than 2 centimeters, which if it's longer constitutes a hammerback. So obviously no way nothing on the back. I don't know that any of these have a hammerback. No, they're all.
That one kind of has something. Is that just a mark?
It's just a mark. So a lot of times, if you look at like an axe that you buy at Walmart or Home Depot or whatever, right, for chopping wood, you'll see that it has that nice round head that curves around, the head, but then it sticks out, on the other side a little ways, right? And sometimes you'll get guys who will get like an axe head like that, and they'll make it usable for armored combat, but you have to grind that backside down a little bit so that it's not more than 2 centimeters from sticking out, right? So if your haft is round, basically you want it to kind of follow the contour of your haft or whatever, and not stick out more than 2 centimeters. On the gauge I have a 2 centimeter depth, and so if I set that on the back of the axe where the head handle, the haft stopped, if I stuck out more than 2 centimeters, then it would be considered a hammer, right? Back in the day, not when I was reffing, in some of the international fights, teams started showing up with literal hammers on the backside, and they said, well, we don't turn the axes around and use them that way, so they should be fine. So they let them use them, and that was true until they fought someone that they didn't think they could beat, and then as soon as the fight started, the axes got shifted around, and they started dropping guys in one shot with the hammers. So that's partly why hammers are not allowed. So yeah, I think Buhert Tech sells a pole arm that does have like a hammer on the back, and it's not very thick, but those are not allowed. So don't think that it's okay just because Buhert or somebody else sells them. Make sure you get the ones that fit with our rules. This is a rule pretty much everywhere. So you'll find it other places you might go. And that is pretty much it for an axe, right? So that's how you would expect kind of axes. Questions about axes and how to inspect them? You guys think? And I can check, see some of these, like, here, give you another one. This one, of course, got that rounded head on it, right?
I don't have a ton of stickers on, so.
Right, so you're looking at, you're at least 15, right, on the top. This edge could be considered potentially problematic because it's kind of sharp, and you can see they were probably asked around this some. To give you a reference, I brought this out because I saw it in the back, right? It's a baseball bat, right? The tip on the head of the baseball bat, see how it's kind of squared off like this? I didn't bring it, but quite often you'll see, we used to see what are called bar maces, which basically is just the pipe on the haft, and the pipe stops right there, right? Well, what then happens, if I hit somebody in the helmet with this side of it, or even say with this bat, which is not the proper curve, that is a sharp edge, and I'm just gonna I'm gonna cut into the middle of your helmet in a little half circle shape and hit your skull with it, right? If I hit you hard enough. That's why everything has to be rounded, because when you hit that tip, that force point of impact is not spread out enough by the round edge, right, of the blade. So we don't allow that with like maces and other axes and weapons. And so this particular piece here at the bottom is definitely something that when you swing in could come down on a helmet potentially, right? And so you want to make sure even those have to be the right roundness, so to speak. This one will be much heavier. Let's see if I can actually get it to measure from it.
This is obviously a pretty long weapon.
Get a chair.
You could just like hang it.
It's dual. Let's see. So, zero it. Not touching the ground. It is 2,250. Okay, it has to be less than 3,000, right?
So good.
So we're good. So that's kind of how you do some of these weapons. When it comes to axes, the pommels are also same rules. So you want that 15 millimeter on the pommels because you can be striking people with pommels. That's pretty much axes. Some differences in things. So these are pretty critical, right? To see these swords. I'll go those.
I'm gonna add this, because I know
Sure.
this is not gonna pass.
So
Strike all big.
a quick distinction in swords, right? This is an arming sword, right? It's made for dueling. It's not made for melees. You could try, but you're probably not gonna be a mosquito, right?
Yeah.
To people. To be quite honest, I get hit with these all the time when I'm reffing. I've taken shots across the back and stuff with them trying to stop fights, and you almost don't even need metal armor. You know, a gambeson would be plenty for these. But there are a few spots on it that you don't want to, that would ouch you. So, not recommending to not wear armor. You see that. So with swords, obviously we have the lengths and we have the weights and stuff. I'm not going to redo those. You can look at the chart and see the exact ones for them. But you have a 10 millimeter tip is the maximum, which is the smallest circle on this guy. And so this blade is definitely not an issue, right? See how much wider it kind of is. I can't even get into the gauge, that sort of thing. So this is definitely a good one. Everything else needs to be in pretty decent repair, and when you look at duelists especially, and even as a melee fighter, I'm holding a weapon in my hand. Let's say my hand is in a gauntlet, and this is how much the crossguard actually sticks out.